The drawing room of Thornbury House smelled of lilies and lawyers, and Verity Lyle stood near the back of it because she had learned, over 36 years, that the back of the room was the safest place to be when her family began dividing things up. Her great-aunt Adelaide had been dead 11 days. The funeral had been enormous. The trade had turned out in force, dealers and collectors and a man from the V&A, because Adelaide Thornbury had been, for half a century, one of the great names in English horology, the firm of Thornbury and Hale spoken of in the same breath as the old masters. The drawing room now held the people who had come not to mourn her but to inherit her, and they had arranged themselves on the good chairs accordingly. Crispin Thornbury sat at the front, in the wing chair that had been Adelaide's, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been managing director of Thornbury and Hale for 9 years, and intended to be its sole proprietor by tea time. He was 50, silver at the temples, beautifully dressed, and he had the particular charm of an auctioneer, the ability to make you feel, while he relieved you of something valuable, that he was doing you a favor. Beside him sat his sister, Davina, all rings and grievance, and his son, Marcus, who was 28 and looked permanently as though he were waiting for a more interesting room to open somewhere else. Verity was the only one standing. She was Adelaide's great-niece, the daughter of Adelaide's late niece, which made her, in the family's bloodless accounting, a sort of second cousin once removed, near enough to be invited and far enough to be ignored. She worked, the family knew vaguely, in a museum restoring things, which they said in the tone people use for jobs that don't pay. She wore a plain gray dress and flat shoes, and she had a small, permanent burn scar on the inside of her right wrist from a soldering iron, and not one person in the room had ever asked about it. "Shall we proceed?" said Mr. Felgate, the solicitor. He moved through it briskly, the way solicitors do when the unhappiness is going to be considerable. Thornbury House and its contents, to Crispin. Adelaide's controlling shareholding in Thornbury and Hale, to Crispin, with smaller parcels to Davina and Marcus. The investment portfolio, the cottage in Rye, the Bentley, distributed among them like cards. Verity listened to her great-aunt's life being parceled out and felt nothing she would have called surprise. Then Mr. Felgate turned a page, and something in his manner changed, a small hesitation, the throat clear of a man relaying a message he did not understand. "To my great-niece, Verity Ann Lyle," he read, "I leave the longcase clock that stands on the half-landing, in the certain knowledge that she alone will know what time it keeps." There was a silence, then Davina laughed, a short, delighted, cruel little sound. "The broken one," she said. "Aunt Adelaide left her the broken clock." Crispin smiled into his folded hands. Everyone in the trade knew the half-landing clock. It was a tall, plain, walnut-cased longcase, 18th century in style but unsigned, and it had stood on that landing for as long as anyone could remember, and it had not worked in living memory. Its hands sat permanently at 4 minutes to midnight. Adelaide had refused, for decades and without explanation, to let anyone touch it, not to restore it, not to sell it, not to so much as wind it. The trade had long ago written it off as a sentimental dud, a journeyman piece of no value that a great maker happened, for her own reasons, to keep. "Well," said Crispin smoothly, rising, brushing the moment away as he brushed away everything inconvenient. "How very like Adelaide, a little joke." He looked at Verity for the first time, and his eyes were kind and final. "It's a dear old thing, Verity, but I should warn you it's worth almost nothing. The movement's seized solid, the case is plain, it's unsigned. If you want, I'll have one of our porters dispose of it for you, save you the carriage." He paused, generous. "Unless you'd like to keep it, for sentiment." "I'd like to keep it," said Verity. "Of course you would," said Davina to the room, and the room smiled. Verity said nothing else. She was looking past them all, through the drawing-room door, to the half-landing where the tall, plain clock stood in shadow with its hands fixed at 4 minutes to 12, and she was thinking about something her great-aunt had said to her once, 20 years ago, in the workshop, with a loop in her eye and her hands inside a movement. A clock that tells the wrong time on purpose, Verity, is the only honest thing in a house full of liars. She had not understood it then. She was beginning, now, to wonder whether she was about to the workshop. What the family did not know, had never troubled to learn, was what Verity Lyle did all day. She was not restoring things in a museum, in the vague way they imagined, the way one might restuff a sofa. Verity was a conservator of horology, one of perhaps a dozen people in the country qualified to do what she did, and quietly regarded by the few who knew the field as the best of them. She had trained for 4 years under Adelaide herself, in the Clerkenwell workshop, before going on to the Royal College, and she now ran the clock and watch conservation studio at one of the great national collections, where governments and insurers and the most serious auction houses in the world sent the pieces that mattered most when they needed to know, beyond doubt, whether a thing was what it claimed to be. She was, in plain terms, one of the people the trade trusted to tell the truth about a clock. She had testified in 2 forgery cases. She had 3 years ago quietly told a Gulf museum that the lost Tompion regulator it was about to buy for a sum with 7 figures in it was a clever marriage of old parts and new work, and the sale had collapsed, and her name had not appeared anywhere, because that was how she preferred it. Verity did not explain herself. She let the movements explain themselves to her. The family knew none of this. To them she was the museum girl, the one who'd never married, who fiddled with old clocks for a wage instead of going into the firm like a proper Thornbury. Crispin had offered her a job at Thornbury and Hale once, years ago, as a junior cataloger, and had seemed genuinely puzzled when she declined. He had never grasped that she was already, by then, several rungs above anything he could offer. She had the clock collected the following week, paid the carriage herself, because Crispin's offer to dispose of it had set something cold and watchful turning over in her chest, and she had it brought not to her flat but to Adelaide's old Clerkenwell workshop, which the will had not mentioned and which, it turned out, Adelaide had quietly transferred into Verity's name 2 years before she died, through a separate deed Mr. Felgate produced with the faint air of a man handing over a loaded thing. The family did not know about the workshop either. Verity stood in it now, the long bench under the north window, the racks of files and gravers and depthing tools, the smell of oil and brass and old wood that was, to her, the smell of being a child who was loved, and she looked at her Greytant's worthless clock standing in the center of the floor, and she rolled up her sleeves over the soldering scar, and she began, the way Adelaide had taught her, by looking. She looked for 3 days before she touched the movement. And what she saw, on the 3rd day, made her sit down slowly on the workshop stool and go very still. The case was plain, yes. Unsigned, yes. But the movement, when she finally opened the hood and held her loop to it, was not the crude journeyman work the trade had assumed from the dull exterior. It was sublime. The wheelwork was cut to a standard she had seen perhaps 4 times in her career. The escapement was a deadbeat of breathtaking precision. And the striking train, the part that made it chime, was unlike anything she had ever seen in her life. Not the standard rack-and-snail of a normal clock, but a vast, complex, custom-built mechanism with a programmable pin barrel, like a music box scaled up and made monstrously intricate, capable of striking not the simple hours but sequences, long, specific, deliberate sequences of bells. Someone, and Verity already knew who, had built a coding machine and hidden it inside a plain brown case where no one would ever think to look. And it had been stopped on purpose at 4 minutes to midnight. Stopped, she now saw, not by failure but by a small steel pin deliberately set into the train to hold it. A pin no accident would ever have placed. A pin that any restorer who did manage to open the seized movement would have removed without thinking, letting the clock run on to midnight, and Verity did not remove the pin. Not yet. First, she wanted to understand what would happen when she did, because Adelaide Thornbury had built a machine, stopped it 4 minutes short of midnight, and left it to the one person she knew would understand that the stopping was the message. She alone will know what time it keeps. "All right, Aunt Adelaide," said Verity quietly to the empty workshop. "Show me." 3 midnight. It took her 2 weeks to make it safe to run. She would not rush it. A seized movement run too soon shears its own teeth, and she would sooner have cut off a finger than break the last thing her great-aunt made. She freed the train wheel by wheel, cleaned 100 years of hardened oil from the pivots, repivoted 2 arbors that had corroded, and rebuilt the great pinned barrel of the striking train tooth by tooth, photographing every pin in its place before she touched it, because she understood by now that the pattern of the pins was the point. And as she mapped the pins, she began to feel the old cold turning over in her chest again, because the pattern was not random and it was not music. There were 13 bells in the striking train. Not 8, not the standard set, 13, tuned, she found when she sounded them, to 13 distinct pitches across just over an octave. And the pins on the barrel were arranged to strike them in groups, separated by gaps, in a sequence that, when she finally laid it all out on a long sheet of paper across the bench, looked exactly like one thing and one thing only. It looked like the cipher Adelaide had taught her when she was 9 years old. Adelaide had called it the Bell alphabet. It had been a game between them, a workshop secret, a way of passing notes a small girl found magical, 13 notes, and you counted intervals between strikes, and the intervals spelled letters. They had written each other dozens of messages in it across one long childhood summer. Verity had not thought of it in 25 years. No one else on earth had ever known it existed. It had lived only between an old woman and a child in a Clerkenwell workshop, and Adelaide had built it, painstakingly, over what must have been months of secret work, into the striking train of a clock she then hid in plain sight and forbade anyone to touch, and stopped 4 minutes before it could ever speak. Verity's hands were not quite steady as she finished the rebuild. She set the clock running on the workshop's calibration stand, let it find its rate over 2 days, set the hands, and waited. She waited until midnight on a Thursday, alone, with the workshop lamps off and the city quiet beyond the north window, and a sheet of paper, and a pencil in front of her, and her own heart loud in her ears. She reached in and drew out the steel pin her great-aunt had set, 20 years or more ago, to hold the world's strangest clock 4 minutes short of speaking. The train began to turn. At midnight in the dark workshop, Adelaide Thornbury's clock began to strike not 12, but a long, deliberate, uneven sequence of bell notes, rising and falling, grouped and spaced, going on far past any hour a clock has business striking, while Verity Lyle's pencil flew across the paper, counting intervals, translating, her childhood and her training and her grief all folding together into the single act of listening, until the last note died away into the dark, and she sat looking down at what the clock had spent 20 years waiting to tell her. It was not a fortune. It was better than a fortune. It was a sentence in her great-aunt's voice spelled out in bells. Behind the third weight, they are forging the masters. Stop the PNDRELL sale. Verity sat in the dark for a long time. Then she got up, crossed to the clock, and looked at the third of its heavy brass driving weights, the one for the striking train, the heaviest, the one no one ever unscrews, and found the seam almost invisible where it came apart. It was hollow, and inside it, rolled tight, was her great-aunt's notebook. For the third weight. Verity read Adelaide's notebook through the night, and by dawn she understood that her great-aunt had not died a sentimental old woman keeping a broken clock. She had died a witness. The notebook was meticulous. Of course it was. Adelaide had measured the universe in fractions of a second her whole life. It documented, in dated entries going back nearly 15 years, the slow corruption of Thornbury and Hale. It had begun small, the way these things do, Crispin, taking over the firm's most profitable arm, had started improving pieces before sale, a replaced dial here, a re-signed backplate there, the small frauds the trade winks at. Then larger. Then, 8 years ago, a step into another country entirely. Crispin had set up a discreet workshop, not Adelaide's, a separate one in a unit near Hatton Garden, staffed by 2 craftsmen of real skill and no scruples, and Thornbury and Hale had begun to manufacture masterpieces, not copies sold as copies. Forgeries, new clocks built from old timber and old brass, aged, distressed, signed with the names of dead masters, and sold through the firm's own sale rooms with confected provenance. Invented chains of fictional aristocratic owners, forged old auction records, faked correspondence at prices that had, over 8 years, brought tens of millions of pounds through Thornbury and Hale. Adelaide had discovered it slowly. She had recognized with the despair of a true craftsman her own techniques in the forgeries, because the forgers had learned from her, from the methods she had spent a lifetime perfecting and had taught the firm. She had confronted Crispin, and Crispin, her own great-nephew, the boy she had brought into the trade, had not been ashamed. He had been patient. He had reminded her gently that she was an old woman with no proof, that the firm carried her name as much as his, that any accusation she made would burn down the reputation of the thing she loved most, that she had in the end far too much to lose. He had counted, in other words, on exactly what such men always count on, that the person who knows the truth will be too compromised, too tired, or too easily dismissed to speak it. He had underestimated her. She had simply stopped fighting where he could see and started building where he could not. The notebook listed 41 forgeries Adelaide had identified, what they were, who had bought them, the fake provenances attached, the dates of sale. And the final entries, the ones in a shakier hand from the last year of her life, all circled the same thing, the thing the clock had named in bells. The pendulum regulator. It was, Adelaide had written, to be Crispin's masterpiece and his greatest crime. An astronomical regulator clock of supposed 18th century date and impossible importance, rediscovered by the firm, authenticated by experts Crispin had cultivated for years, and about to be sold. Verity checked the date and felt the floor tilt in 11 days to the Thornbury collection, the great National Museum of Science and Timekeeping, as the centerpiece of its new gallery, for a sum the notebook recorded in Adelaide's disbelieving hand, £4.8 million, public money. They are selling the nation a lie. And the last line, written perhaps a fortnight before she died. Verity will know it is false. I built the proof into every true thing I ever made. She knows where to look. She is the only one who does. Verity closed the notebook as the light came up gray over Clerkenwell. She had 11 days. 5 quiet competence. She did not call the police. She did not call the family. She did what Adelaide had raised her to do, which was to be certain before she spoke, because a conservator who cries forgery and turns out to be wrong is finished, and a conservator who cries forgery against a great auction house and turns out to be wrong is worse than finished. And Crispin, she knew now, would be waiting for exactly that mistake. She needed to examine the pendulum regulator herself. This was not as impossible as it would have been for anyone else, and here, for the first time, the thing the family had never bothered to understand became Verity's weapon. The Thornbury collection did not know her as a Thornbury relative. It knew her as Verity Lyle, the conservator from the National Collection, whose word on a movement was as good as a court's. And when a clock of national importance is about to be bought with public money, it is entirely ordinary, expected, even for it to be sent to an independent conservator for a final technical condition report before the sale completes. Verity made one telephone call to a contact at the Thornbury, a curator named Dr. Naomi Actor with whom she had worked for years, and said, in the mild voice she used for the things that mattered most, that she would be willing to provide an independent pre-acquisition assessment of the pendulum regulator, at no fee, if the museum wished. Dr. Actor, who trusted Verity completely and had been faintly uneasy about the pendril for reasons she could not name, said yes within the hour. The regulator was couriered to Verity's studio under guard. It was, she had to admit as it stood gleaming under her lamps, magnificent. Whoever had built it was an artist. The case was right, the dial was right, the patina was right, the wear in the right places, the dust of 2 centuries in the seams. A good expert would pass it. A great one might pass it. It was the best forgery Verity Lyle had ever seen, and she understood, looking at it, exactly why Adelaide had grieved. Because the hand that made this was, unmistakably, a hand that had been taught by Adelaide herself. But Adelaide had thought of that too. I built the proof into every true thing I ever made. Verity knew what she meant, because she was the only person alive who did. Across her whole long career, Adelaide Thornbury had concealed a private mark in the movements of her genuine work, not a signature, nothing a forger could copy, because no forger knew it was there. It was a deliberate, microscopic, structural choice she made in a single component, the same choice every time, invisible without magnification and meaningless to anyone who didn't know to look. On a particular hidden surface of a particular wheel, she cut a tiny constellation of 3 dots in a precise arrangement, her own quiet fingerprint. Adelaide was here, and Adelaide tells the truth. She had shown it to Verity once, when Verity was 19, and made her promise never to speak of it, and said, "One day this may matter more than anything I teach you." The forgers had learned Adelaide's techniques. They had not learned her secret, because Adelaide had only ever told one person on Earth. If the pendril was genuinely old, it would not have the mark. If it was a forgery built by people copying Adelaide's methods, it would also not have the mark, and that alone proved nothing. But Adelaide's notebook had told Verity something more. Among the 41 forgeries, Adelaide had recorded that the Hatton Garden forgers in their arrogance had begun adding what they believed were period makers' secrets to make their fakes more convincing, and that they had, fatally, started copying a mark they had glimpsed in one of Adelaide's genuine pieces without understanding it. They had reproduced her 3 dots, badly, in the wrong place, with the wrong spacing, as a flourish, thinking it was decoration. The forgery would betray itself not by lacking Adelaide's mark, but by wearing a clumsy imitation of it, proof not merely that it was new, but that it had come out of a workshop that had studied Adelaide Thornbury's most secret work at close hand, proof that pointed straight back to Thornbury and Hale. Verity took the regulator's striking train apart with the patience of a surgeon, laid the 3rd wheel under the highest magnification in the studio, and photographed what she found there. 3 dots in the wrong place, with the wrong spacing. She had them. 6. Who is she? She should have known she could not move that quietly for long. The first sign was a voicemail from Crispin, warm, casual. Just heard the dear old pendril's gone off to some museum conservator for a report. No idea who. Do hope they know their business, ha ha. The second was a call from Dr. Actor, apologetic and confused. The Aldermary had received concerns from Thornbury and Hale about the independence of its chosen conservator, who, the firm had helpfully pointed out, was a member of the family of the consignor and therefore hardly impartial. Crispin had found out who she was. It was, Verity realized, the cleverest move he could have made and the most revealing. He could not have known yet what she had found. But the instant he learned that the conservator examining his masterpiece was Adelaide's great-niece, the museum girl, the one who fiddled with clocks, some animal instinct in him had understood she was dangerous, and he had moved to have her removed from the case before she could open her mouth. What he did not understand, even now, was the size of his miscalculation. He thought he was discrediting a relative with a grudge. He did not know he was up against the conservator the Aldermary trusted most, holding her own great-aunt's documented evidence and a photograph of his forger's fatal mistake. but the museum could not ignore a conflict of interest complaint, however motivated. Dr. Actor, miserable, told Verity the assessment would have to be reassigned to an agreed independent expert. And the expert Thornbury and Hale proposed, and the museum, under pressure and short of time before the sale, reluctantly accepted, was a Dr. Lionel Crewe. Verity knew the name. Dr. Lionel Crewe had authenticated 19 of the 41 forgeries in Adelaide's notebook. Crispin had not just removed her, he had replaced her with his own man. It would have ended there for almost anyone. The clock would go to Crewe, Crewe would pronounce it genuine, the museum would pay its £4.8 million, the nation would hang a forgery in its temple of true time, and the woman who knew better would be a discredited relative with a grudge and no standing. Verity sat in the workshop that had been her great-aunt's, with the genuine clock ticking on the calibration stand and the false one's photograph spread across the bench, and she did not panic, because Adelaide had not raised her to panic. She thought about the one thing Crispin's whole strategy depended on, the thing every man like him depended on, the thing that had nearly let him win. He needed the truth to stay private. He needed it confined to rooms he controlled, a museum's quiet acquisition process, a tame expert's report, a relative's deniable complaint. As long as it stayed private, his money and his reputation and his network of cultivated experts would always outweigh her. So she would not keep it private. She picked up the telephone and made 2 calls. The first was to a journalist on a national paper who had covered the antiquities forgery beat for a decade, and whose number Verity had kept since she'd been a quiet, unnamed source on a watch fraud case 4 years before. The second was to Dr. Naomi Ackhutter. "Naomi," she said, "before the Aldermary completes on the Pendrell, I want to ask you for one thing, not as Adelaide's relative, as Verity Lyle." She looked at the 3 false dots glowing on her monitor. "I want you to let me present my findings, publicly, at the unveiling." The Aldermary was holding a launch event for its new gallery in 9 days. Press, trustees, donors, the trade, the cameras of the arts programs, at which the Pendrell regulator was to be revealed to the nation as the museum's crowning acquisition. It was the one room Crispin Thornbury could not control. 7. The strike. Crispin did not wait passively for the museum to make its decision. Men like him never do. 3 nights before the unveiling, the Clerkenwell workshop was broken into. Verity arrived in the morning to find the door forced, the place turned over, drawers emptied, the calibration stand knocked askew. It was meant, she understood at once, to look like an opportunist burglary, and it had been done by someone who knew clocks, because the one thing taken, the only thing, was Adelaide's notebook from where it had sat on the bench. For a moment, standing in the wreckage of the room where she had learned to love the truth, Verity felt the cold close fully over her heart at last, because the notebook was the evidence. The notebook was Adelaide's voice. The notebook was 41 documented crimes and a dead woman's testimony, and it was gone. Then she breathed, and the cold receded because Adelaide had raised her, and Adelaide had been thinking about men like Crispin for 15 years. Verity did not have Adelaide's notebook anymore. She had something Crispin would never think to look for, because he did not know it existed, because it had lived only between an old woman and a child. She had a recording of the clock. On the night the clock first struck, Verity, conservator to her bones, who documented everything, had set a recorder running on the bench. She had the full 13-bell sequence captured in high fidelity, the message in Adelaide's own machine, in Adelaide's own cipher, time-stamped and untouched. And she had, in her own studio at the National Collection, behind locks Crispin could not force, every photograph. The false dots on the Pendrell, the true dots on Adelaide's genuine work beside them, the whole forensic chain laid out. The notebook had been corroboration. It had never been the heart of her case. The heart of her case was a thing Crispin had handed her himself, 11 days ago, in a drawing room full of laughter, calling it worthless. She rang the journalist back. "They've just told me," she said, "exactly how frightened they are." 8. The unveiling. The Aldermary Collection's new gallery was a long, beautiful room of glass and old oak, and on the night of the unveiling it was full. Trustees in black tie, donors, the director, two arts correspondents with camera crews, a cluster from the antiques trade, and near the center, beneath a silk cover on a plinth lit like an altar, the pendril regulator waiting to be revealed to the nation. Crispin Thornbury was there, of course, magnificent in evening dress, the gracious vendor of the great clock, accepting congratulations with the warmth of a man whose victory was complete. Davina was beside him, Marcus bored by the champagne. And at the edge of the room, in the same plain gray she had worn to the will reading, unremarked, stood Verity Lyle, who had been invited by Dr. Naomi Actor in her capacity as a conservator of the National Collection, and whose presence Crispin noted with a flicker of irritation and then dismissed, because what could the museum girl do here, in his moment, in his room? The director made a speech. He spoke of the museum's mission to hold the nation's horological heritage in trust, of the generosity of donors, of the extraordinary good fortune that had brought the lost pendril regulator home. He invited Crispin Thornbury to say a few words about the clock his firm had so brilliantly rediscovered. Crispin spoke beautifully, he always did. And when he finished, and the director moved toward the silk cover to perform the unveiling, Dr. Naomi Actor stepped forward instead and said, into the microphone in a clear and slightly trembling voice, "Before we unveil, the trustees have asked that we hear, in the interest of complete transparency, a short presentation from an independent conservator, Ms. Verity Lyle." The room turned. Crispin's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. Verity walked to the front. She did not hurry. She set a small laptop on the lectern and connected it to the gallery's screen, and she began to speak in the mild, exact, unhurried voice of a woman who had spent her life telling brass and steel apart from lies. She did not accuse, she demonstrated. She put up the image of a wheel, the third wheel of the pendril striking train, magnified 400 times, and on it 3 small dots, clumsily cut, oddly spaced. "This mark," she said, "was added to this clock by its maker to make it appear more authentic. I want to show you what it was imitating." She put up a second image beside it, another wheel, 3 dots microscopically precise, perfectly placed. "This is the private mark of Adelaide Thornbury," she said quietly, "concealed in her genuine work across 50 years. She showed it to one person. She never recorded it anywhere a forger could find. Its purpose was to do exactly what it is about to do." She let the 2 images sit side by side on the great screen, the true and the false, for the whole room to see. "The clock you are about to buy was not made in the 18th century. It was made recently, by someone who studied Adelaide Thornbury's most secret techniques at close hand, and copied a mark they did not understand. It is a forgery, and I can tell you precisely the workshop it came from." The room had gone utterly silent. Crispin moved a half-step toward the lectern, the charm cracking into something colder. "This is absurd," he said, loud and smooth. "This woman is my late aunt's relative. She has a personal grievance. She has no standing. She has no evidence beyond a smudge on a wheel and a story about a secret mark only she claims to know." "That's true," said Verity. "It would be only my word." She looked at him then fully for the first time all evening. "Except that Adelaide left me one more thing." And she pressed a key, and into the silent gallery from the laptop speakers came the sound of a clock striking midnight, not 12, but a long, uneven, deliberate sequence of bell notes, rising and falling, going on far past any hour. "This is the striking sequence of the clock my great-aunt left me in her will," said Verity over the bells. "The clock this firm valued at nothing and offered to throw away. Adelaide built a coded message into it, in a cipher she taught me as a child. I have had it independently verified by a cryptographer at the National Collection this week. She looked at the trade, at the trustees, at the cameras. It says, they are forging the masters. Stop the pendrel sale. The bells faded. It is dated by the mechanism to the final year of her life. It is her testimony, and it names this. She put up the final image, the cover page of Adelaide's notebook, because Verity, who documented everything, had photographed every page of it the night she first read it, long before Crispin's men ever broke in to steal the original. Page after page filled the screen now. 41 forgeries, dates, buyers, fake provenances. Dr. Lionel Crew's name 19 times. The original of this notebook, Verity said, into the absolute stillness of the room, was stolen from my workshop 3 nights ago. I had already copied every page. I think the theft tells you, better than I can, whether what's in it is true. Somewhere in the room, an arts correspondence camera was recording all of it. Crispin Thornbury stood beside his masterpiece, under the lights, in the one room he could not control, and watched 15 years of careful, patient, profitable lying come apart in front of the nation in the time it takes a clock to strike. 9. The reckoning. It ended the way these things end, once the first true thing is said where it cannot be unsaid. The Aldermary withdrew from the pendrel sale that night. The £4.8 million of public money stayed in the public's hands. The arts correspondents had their story by morning, and it was an extraordinary one. A great auction house, a forgery factory, a dead master craftswoman who had built her evidence into a clock and left it to the one relative her family had spent her whole life ignoring. The investigation that followed was long and thorough, and Adelaide's documentation, 41 pieces named buyers, the Hatton Garden Workshop, the cultivated experts, gave it everything it needed. Thornbury and Hale, a name spoken for a century in the same breath as the masters, did not survive it. The firm's sales were frozen, its clients fled, its reputation, the only thing a house like that truly owns, evaporated. Dr. Lionel Crew's career ended in a regulatory hearing. The 2 craftsmen from Hatton Garden, when the offer of leniency was put to them, gave up Crispin entirely. Crispin Thornbury was charged with conspiracy to defraud, with forgery, with the fraudulent obtaining of millions of pounds across 8 years. The break-in at the workshop, clumsy, traceable, ordered in panic, added more. He was not destroyed by Verity, and she was careful always afterward to say so. He was destroyed by the thing he had spent his life assuming did not apply to him. The slow, patient, certain return of the truth, carried for 15 years by an old woman he had bullied into silence and underestimated to the last, and set ticking inside a plain brown clock he had laughed at and called worthless. He had handed it to the museum girl himself. He had judged her completely wrong. Davina did not call. Marcus, to everyone's surprise, did once awkwardly to say that he hadn't known, that he was sorry, that he hadn't understood what Aunt Adelaide had been or what she, Verity, was either. Verity thanked him and meant it, and did not pretend it healed anything, because she had been raised by a woman who did not pretend. 10. What time it keeps. The Aldermary collection asked Verity to stay on, formally now, as the consultant conservator for its horology gallery, the woman whose word the nation would trust about its clocks. She said yes. They asked, too, whether the museum might one day display a particular clock, a tall, plain, walnut-cased longcase, unsigned, its hands set permanently at 4 minutes to midnight, with a label explaining what it had done. Verity thought about that for a long time, and in the end she said no, not to the museum, but to the 4 minutes to midnight. Because Adelaide had stopped the clock there on purpose in the years when she could not yet speak, when the truth was not yet safe, when the message had to wait. And the message had been delivered. The waiting was over. So Verity took the clock back to the Clerkenwell workshop one last evening, and she removed the steel pin for good, and she set the hands, and she let it run properly, freely, for the first time in 20 years. And she let it strike midnight in full, all 13 bells. the whole long sequence, her great-aunt's voice ringing out one final time in the room where they had loved each other. Then she reset the striking train to strike, from now on, the ordinary hours, 12 at midnight, like any honest clock that has nothing left to hide. She gave it to the museum after that, the message spent, the secret kept and then told, and on the small brass plaque beneath it, she had them engrave not Adelaide's dates or the word forgery or any of the scandal, but a single line, the thing Adelaide had said to a 9-year-old girl in a workshop a lifetime before, the line that turned out to be the truest thing anyone in that family ever said. A clock that tells the wrong time on purpose is the only honest thing in a house full of liars. Verity Lyle stood in front of it on the morning the gallery opened, in her plain gray dress, with the old burned scar on her wrist and a loop in her pocket out of habit, and watched the public file past the plain brown clock without a second glance. The worthless one, the broken one, the one the great auction house had offered to throw away. They had handed her a broken clock to humiliate her. And the deepest truth of all, deeper than the cipher, older than the fraud, was the one Adelaide had understood her whole long life and had finally, in bells, in brass, in the dark, made the world understand too. That the people who do the real and patient and quiet work, the ones the loud and the greedy never trouble to look at twice, are very often the only ones in the room still keeping the right time. You just have to know how to listen.